I'm Laura Gray, 29 years old. Last Christmas, my father looked me dead in the eye, smirked, and called me a fool for carefully holding onto my grandmother's gift. It was a check for $5 million. He ripped his to shreds. My mother tore hers in half. My sister tossed hers into the fireplace just to film it for a video. My brother crumpled his under his boot. I was the only one who smoothed out the paper, tucked it into my wallet, and said thank you. The next morning, a bank manager locked the door, sat me down, and said 4 words I will never forget. My family spent the rest of that year trying to claw back what they had laughed at and what they had destroyed, only to find that it changed everything I ever knew about my own blood. Before I expose this brutal truth, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to that Christmas Eve, to the last dinner my grandmother ever cooked. Sylvia Gray's house in Hollow Ridge hadn't been locked in 47 years. That night, the air still smelled of oak wood, baked banana bread, and a bone-chilling silence that signaled the end of family loyalty. The wind didn't just blow in Hollow Ridge, it bit. It carried the kind of mountain cold that seeped through military-grade wool and settled in your marrow. I stood by the window, back straight, hands clasped behind me in a parade rest that had become my default setting after a decade in logistics. I wasn't just a daughter home for the holidays. I was an observer. I was running a risk assessment on the people who shared my DNA. The front door didn't open. It was invaded. Richard Gray led the charge. My father. He didn't knock. He kicked the slush off his heavy work boots right onto Grandma Sylvia's polished hardwood floor, leaving a trail of gray filth. He didn't offer a greeting. He just grunted about the drive and headed straight for the head of the table, claiming the seat of power he hadn't earned. Grant followed, smelling of cheap cigarettes and desperation. He tossed his truck keys onto the lace tablecloth like he owned the place. He didn't look at Grandma. He pointed a greasy finger at my face. "Check the radiator on my rig tomorrow, Laura. The engine's knocking like a drum," he barked. To him, a captain in the United States Army was just a free mechanic with a set of tools. Then came Holland. Her face was buried in her phone, the artificial blue light reflecting off her expensive veneers. She didn't say hello, she just panned her camera around the room, her voice a forced, high-pitched chirp for her live stream. "Look at this vintage sofa, guys. Totally shabby chic, or just, actually shabby," she whispered to her 1,000 anonymous followers. My mother, Linda, brought up the rear, adjusted her faux fur coat, and sighed at the quaintness of it all. Dinner was a tactical disaster. The air was thick with the scent of Christmas ham and baked banana bread, but the conversation was pure poison. Richard complained the food was slow. Linda made snide remarks about Grandma Sylvia's pensioner lifestyle. Grant spent the meal demanding I transfer him a couple of $100 for a speeding ticket. I sat at the corner, spine pinned against the chair. In Afghanistan, a stranger in a dusty uniform once shared his last liter of water with me when our convoy hit a ditch. Here, at this table, my own brother wanted me under his truck in a blizzard because he was too lazy to pay a pro. Grandma Sylvia didn't say a word. She wore a corn-yellow sweater, her silver hair pinned back tight. She moved with a quiet, calculated grace that reminded me of a general preparing a final maneuver. When the plates were cleared, she stood up and walked to the oak sideboard. She pulled out a small oak box. The room went quiet, but not out of respect. It was the silence of vultures waiting for a carcass to drop. She pulled out 5 cream-colored envelopes and slid one toward each of us. Richard tore his open like a child at a birthday party. His face went pale, his jaw unhinged. He stared at the check from First National Bank. "Is this some kind of sick joke, Ma?" he growled, slamming the paper onto the wood. $5 million. The numbers were crisp, bold, irrefutable. The room didn't erupt in gratitude. It erupted in madness. 5 million, Grant laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. He crumpled the check into a ball and flicked it onto the rug like a losing lottery ticket. "You don't have 25 grand in the bank, let alone 25 million. "This is dementia talk," Linda scoffed, tearing her check in half with a sharp, decisive zip. Honestly, Sylvia, I thought we were past the games. This is just cruel, she said, tossing the fragments into the gravy boat. But Holland was the worst. She picked up her check, angled her phone to get the lighting just right, and flashed the $5 million figure to her camera. Check out this prop, guys. Grandma's gone totally off the deep end for the holidays. Watch this. She tossed the check into the roaring fireplace. I watched the fire lick the edges of the paper. I smelled the acrid scent of burning ink and expensive stationery. The conflagration swallowed $5 million in 3 seconds while Holland's followers spammed red heart emojis on her screen. Grandma Sylvia didn't blink. She stood there, cold and immovable, watching the ash of her legacy swirl up the chimney. I looked down at my check. The blue ink was familiar. I felt the weight of it. I didn't care if it was a test or a miracle. I smoothed the crease with my thumb, folded it into a neat square, and tucked it deep into my left chest pocket, right beneath my military ribbons. I stood up. I didn't look at my father's sneer or my brother's mocking grin. I looked directly at the woman in the yellow sweater. "Thank you, Grandma," I said. My voice was clear, the way it was when I delivered a status report. She gave a single, sharp nod. Her eyes flashed with a lethal intelligence I had never noticed before. "Only once, Laura," she whispered. I walked out the door without a coat. The Hollow Ridge blizzard hit me like a physical wall, the snow stinging my skin. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the sharp corner of the paper through the fabric. My grandmother lived on a fixed pension in a house with a leaking roof. Where did she get $25 million to burn? I realized then that I wasn't just going to the bank tomorrow. I was going to war. And my family had already surrendered their only ammunition. The tires hummed a low, hypnotic tune against the cracked asphalt of Interstate 95. 200 miles. That was the distance between my base and the porch where Grandma Sylvia waited every Saturday. For 10 years, while my peers were hitting the dive bars or sleeping off a week of drills, I was behind the wheel of my battered F-150. I didn't do it for an inheritance. I did it because, in a family of vultures, she was the only one who didn't try to pick my bones clean. The routine was ironclad. I'd pull into the gravel driveway of that old Hollow Ridge house, the engine ticking as it cooled. She'd be there, always. Sitting in that wicker chair, wearing a sweater that smelled like cedar and line-dried laundry. She'd look me over, her eyes scanning my uniform for tears, or my face for the kind of hardness that only comes from seeing too much dirt and blood. "You still got your soul, Laura?" she'd ask, her voice like dry leaves. "Still got it, Grandma," I'd reply, standing a little straighter. We'd sit in the kitchen, the linoleum floor worn thin by 50 years of footsteps. I'd tell her about my platoon, about the logistics of moving tons of steel across a desert, and the sheer stupidity of brass hat politics. She'd listen, nodding, pouring black coffee into chipped mugs. But last October, the rhythm broke. I watched her hand. It wasn't just old, it was failing. As she reached for the creamer, her fingers did a jagged little dance, a tremor. My military training kicked in. The same brain that tracked supply chain disruptions noticed the slight yellowing of her eyes. The way her grip on the spoon was desperate, not firm. When I'd leave on Sunday evenings, she had a habit. She'd press 2 crumpled $10 bills into my palm. "For gas," she'd whisper. I didn't need it. My captain's pay was enough. But I knew the rules of pride. I'd take them, nod, and once I was back in the truck, I'd tuck them into an old Nike shoebox under the seat. That box was full of her love, measured out in 10s and 20s. The piece of Hollow Ridge never survived the drive back. As soon as my truck hit the main highway, the minefield, active. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. "Again? You're up there sucking up to that old woman again?" It was my mother, Linda. "No, how are you? No, are you safe?" Just a sharp, jagged tone that made my jaw ache. "She's your mother, Mom," I said, my voice flat. "She's a drain, Laura, and you're just her little pet. Don't let her talk you into giving her any of your base pay. You know your brother is struggling." Grant's voice crackled in the background, muffled but loud enough. "Tell her I need 2 bills. I got a speeding ticket in the county. Tell the army girl to cough it up. Then came the text from Holland. L-Dog, can I use your credit card for a sec? Need to book a venue for a collab. I'll pay you back next month. Promise. They saw the uniform, the rank, and the hazard pay I'd earned in the sand, and all they heard was a cash register. They didn't see the woman who spent her leave scrubbing a kitchen floor for an 82-year-old. They didn't see the daughter who bought grandma's heart meds out of pocket because the insurance was a joke. Mid-October brought a cold snap. The oak leaves turned the color of dried blood and littered the yard. The sun was setting, casting long skeletal shadows across the kitchen table when Grandma finally sat me down. Laura, she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was steady, like a weather report. The doctors called, pancreatic, stage 4, I've known since July. The world tilted. I felt the air leave the room. My hand tightened around my coffee mug until the ceramic bit into my palm, but I didn't let a single drop spill. Military discipline. You don't cry on the battlefield. You stabilize the situation. Chemo, we can get you into the VA or a specialist in Boston. I'll pay for it, I said, the words coming out fast, tactical. She shook her head, a slow, final movement. No tubes, Laura. No hospital beds with plastic sheets and nurses who don't know my name. I'm not spending my last days being poked while your father and the rest of them stand in the hall arguing over who gets the house. She reached out, her hand cold, but her grip surprisingly fierce. Keep this quiet between us. I want this Christmas to be real. I want one more year of pretending your father has a shred of decency left in him. I looked into those sharp, intelligent eyes. She wasn't just dying, she was planning. She was a woman who had spent 47 years watching her children turn into monsters, and she was setting a trap. I'm going to give some gifts this year, Laura, she whispered, a lethal glint in her eyes. It's going to be interesting. That was the reason for the checks, the $5 million each, a test, a final brutal evaluation of their souls. I sat there, the weight of her secret pressing against my ribs, realizing she had chosen me to be her witness. It's a heavy weight to carry, isn't it? Being the only one who gives a damn while everyone else is just looking for a payday. This is what we call caregiver burnout, the exhaustion of the heart. If you've ever felt like the only responsible person in a room full of vultures, I want to hear from you. Your support keeps this story alive. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's show the world that loyalty still matters. If you've ever been the responsible one in your family, type, I'm here, in the comments. I'm reading every single one. I drove back to base that night in total silence. No radio, just the wind. I kept thinking about the shoebox of gas money under my seat and the $5 million check Grandma had tucked into my pocket 2 months later. She wasn't just a pensioner with a leaking roof. She was a woman with a $40 million secret, and the war was only just beginning. Tomorrow morning, when the bank opened, the first shot would be fired, and I was the only one who knew where the ammunition was hidden. 8 in the morning on December 26th is a cold, hollow time in Hollow Ridge. The town is hungover from the holidays, draped in gray slush and discarded wrapping paper. I sat in the lobby of First National Bank, my back not touching the plastic seat, my boots clean of the morning's mud. The air in the lobby was stale, pumped full of artificial heat that smelled like scorched dust. Across from me, a decorative tree dropped fake silver needles onto a carpet that had seen too many winters. Benedict Strom, the branch manager, did not walk toward me. He hurried. Benedict was a man who lived for iron shirts and predictable interest rates, but today his silk tie was crooked. He looked like he had spent the night staring at a ghost. He gave me a nod that was more of a twitch and led me back to his office. The office was small, crammed with the heavy scent of old paper and the dry heat of an electric fireplace built into the wall. The orange light of the fake flames flickered against the mahogany desk, and for a second, my nose twitched. I could still smell the acrid, chemical stench from the night before when Holland had tossed $5 million into the Oakwood fire. Benedict did not sit down. He walked to the door, checked the hallway, and then closed it. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was a sharp, dry snap. It was the sound of a secret being locked in a cage. He turned around, his face the color of wet chalk, and leaned his weight against the desk. He was sweating despite the winter chill outside. I did not offer a greeting. I pulled the cream-colored envelope from my chest pocket. I laid the check on the blotter. The blue ink looked like a bruise on the white paper. $5 million. Benedict stared at it. He did not touch it at first, as if the paper might burn his fingers. He pulled a pair of spectacles from his pocket, his hands shaking so hard the metal frames rattled against his teeth. He leaned in close, his breath hitching in his chest. "Laura," he said. His voice was a ragged whisper, stripped of all professional polish. "Where did you get this?" I kept my spine pinned to the back of the chair. My eyes stayed locked on his. "A Christmas gift from my grandmother." Benedict took a deep breath, his chest heaving under his white shirt. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick blue folder. He did not look at the papers inside. He looked at me. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. And then he spoke the 4 words that changed the gravity of my world. "The check is real." The air in my lungs felt like lead. Even with a decade of military discipline, even after seeing convoys blown to scrap metal in the desert, I felt my heart skip a beat. I needed 3 seconds to process the data. It was not a joke. It was not dementia. My family, my own father, my mother, my siblings, had spent the previous night laughing while they tore, crushed, and incinerated $20 million. They had destroyed a fortune because they were too arrogant to believe an old woman in a yellow sweater could hold any power. Benedict slid the blue folder across the desk toward me. "Sylvia came in here back in early November. She sat exactly where you are sitting now. She did not smile once. She had me set up 5 separate withdrawal orders. $25 million in total, moved from an offshore holding into liquid accounts." My mind started running the numbers, the tactical analysis clicking into place. How does a pensioner with a leaking roof move $25 million without the IRS knocking the door down? I asked. My voice remained flat, a stark contrast to the panic in the room. Benedict gave a jagged, humorless laugh. He leaned over and turned his computer monitor toward me. "Because, Laura, that $25 million was just the surface. It was the pocket change." I looked at the screen. The numbers hit me like a physical blow. The total asset balance was sitting at over $40 million. Real estate holdings in the South. Diversified portfolios hidden behind 3 layers of shell companies. My grandmother, the woman who gave me $10 bills for gas and lived on baked banana bread, was an anonymous millionaire. She had been sitting on a mountain of gold while Richard complained about the cost of her ham. "She told me exactly what would happen," Benedict whispered, wiping sweat from his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. "She said they would think she was crazy. She said they would treat the money like trash." I stood up and took the check back. I folded it once and put it back in my pocket, right over my heart. "Keep this between us, Benedict. That is an order." I walked out of the bank. The December wind hit me in the face, sharp and clean, but it could not wash away the disgust in my throat. I reached for my truck door, my fingers grazing the cold, rusted handle of the F-150. Just as I touched the metal, the phone in my pocket exploded. It started with a long, violent vibration, then a chime, then another. I pulled it out. 32 notifications from the family group chat, a missed call from Grant, a frantic text from my mother. The bank's automated fraud system had done its job. As soon as Benedict had flagged the accounts for verification, the system had sent out automatic calls to every recipient of the checks to verify their status. My family was finding out. They were realizing that the scraps of paper in the trash and the ash in the fireplace were not props. They were the keys to a life they had never earned. I climbed into the truck and turned the key. The engine groaned, coughing against the cold before it settled into a low roar. I watched the screen of my phone light up again with my father's name. I did not answer. The carnage had begun. The vultures had realized they had eaten their own wings, and they were going to be looking for someone to blame. I put the truck in gear and headed toward the hill. I had $40 million of my grandmother's legacy to protect, and the enemy was already at the gates. It took exactly 112 minutes for the bomb to go off. I sat in the idling F-15, the heater blowing dry, dusty air against my face. The bank's automated fraud system was efficient. It didn't care about family ties. It only cared about the status of $20 million in canceled paper. My phone, resting in the center console, became a live wire. It vibrated with such violence it rattled against the plastic, a jagged siren of desperate greed. I picked it up. A voicemail from Holland. Her voice was a wet, shaky mess of mascara and panic. "Laura, oh my God, tell me this is a joke. The bank called. They said the check was void. Tell Grandma I was just playing for the fans. Tell her to reissue it. Please, Laura, my life is over if this isn't real." Then came a text from Grant. No tears there. Just the blunt force trauma of a man who realized he'd just burned his future. "I know you still got yours. You hide that check or I'm coming for it. That's family money, you little bitch. Don't think that uniform makes you untouchable." My mother's voice followed in a flurry of 3-minute rants. She wasn't asking, she was screaming. She called Grandma a senile old fraud and a manipulative witch. She demanded I turn the truck around and bring the old lady to her house so they could settle this like adults. I didn't reply. I didn't even breathe hard. I reached out, my thumb pressing the power button until the screen went black. Total noise discipline. In the desert, noise got you killed. In Hollow Ridge, it just let the vultures know where the meat was. I shoved the truck into gear. The blizzard had turned the world into a blinding sheet of white static. The wipers struggled against the heavy, wet slush, but I kept my foot steady on the gas. I had to reach the hill before the storm turned into a riot. 40 minutes later, I pulled into Grandma Sylvia's gravel drive. I had just stepped into the kitchen, the smell of pine and cold floorboards greeting me, when a high-pitched squeal of tires cut through the wind. A heavy Ford pickup truck took the corner too fast, fishtailing in the snow before slamming to a halt right behind my F-150. Richard Gray didn't wait for the engine to die. He vaulted out of the cab, his work coat unzipped, his face a mottled, angry purple that made him look like he was having a stroke. The veins in his neck were thick cords, pulsing with a rhythm of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look at the snow. He didn't look at me. He charged up the porch steps, his heavy boots sounding like falling timber. He hammered his fist against the solid oak door. Boom! 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 "Sylvia, open this damn door," he roared. His voice cracked against the freezing air. "I know you're in there. Open up and reissue those checks right now. You think you can play us for fools? You think you can treat us like dogs?" Grant's truck pulled in seconds later. He jumped out, his eyes darting around the perimeter like a looter looking for a weak spot. He started circling the house, cupping his hands against the windows, his breath fogging the glass as he tried to catch a glimpse of the woman who had dared to give him everything and watch him throw it away. I stepped toward the door, my hand reaching for the latch. I was ready to end this. My muscles were coiled, my eyes scanning Richard's stance for a point of impact. But a hand, thin and cold as a winter branch, caught my wrist. Grandma Sylvia stood there. She was still wearing that corn-yellow sweater. She looked small, but as she moved past me, she carried the weight of a heavy artillery piece. She didn't look afraid. She looked finished. She walked right up to the heavy glass pane of the door. Richard was still there, his face pressed so close he was leaving spit on the glass. He looked like a man possessed, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on the fortune he had burned in the fireplace. "Richard," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through his screaming like a razor. He froze. He stopped pounding, his fist hanging in mid-air. "I gave you $5 million, she said, her voice flat, devoid of any motherly warmth. "I gave each of you a life you didn't earn. And 4 of you, my own blood, decided that paper was trash. You tore it, you burned it, you laughed while you did it. The test is over, Richard. The result is recorded. Now, get off my porch and go home." Richard's face went from purple to a ghostly, sickly white. He let out a jagged string of curses, his hand reaching out to grab the handle, his foot pulling back to kick the wood. He was a man who had never been told no by a woman he couldn't bully. Before his boot could make contact, Grandma Sylvia reached up. Clack. The sound was small, but in the silence of that kitchen, it sounded like a gunshot. Her fingers, steady and deliberate, slid the heavy brass deadbolt into its socket. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the blizzard. For 47 years, that door had remained unlocked. It was the symbol of Hollow Ridge hospitality, a sign that family was always welcome. But that sound marked the end of an era. The bolt was home. The gray bloodline was officially on the outside, and for the first time in nearly half a century, they were strangers to the woman who had raised them. Grandma Sylvia turned her back on the door. She didn't look through the glass to see her son's face crumble into a mask of pathetic, greedy desperation. She didn't watch Grant kick a hole in a porch planter. She just looked at me. "Check the perimeter, Laura," she said, her voice like iron. I stood tall, my heels clicking together on the hardwood. I didn't feel like a granddaughter. I felt like a sentry. I realized then that the fight wasn't just about the money anymore. It was a siege. And as the wind howled outside, I knew my mission had just shifted from observation to survival. Richard was still screaming, but the brass bolt didn't care. Neither did I. January didn't bring a fresh start to Hollow Ridge. It brought a brutal gray slush and the sound of Grandma Sylvia's hip shattering against the bathroom tiles at 3 a.m. Pancreatic cancer had already been eating her from the inside out, but that fall took the one thing she had left: her autonomy. I didn't call for a nursing home. I knew the drill. In the States, if you're old and you don't have a mountain of cash for a high-end facility, you end up in a place that smells like bleach and forgotten souls. I wasn't letting her go out like that. I filed for emergency leave from the base, packed my rucksack, and moved into her living room. The transition was tactical. I pushed the floral sofa into the corner to make room for a rented hospital bed. I stripped the lace doilies off the end tables to make space for morphine vials, antiseptic wipes, and a blood pressure cuff. My life became a series of spreadsheets, med logs, turning schedules to prevent bed sores, caloric intake. I ran that house like a forward operating base. The smell of baked banana bread was gone, replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of isopropyl alcohol and the heavy metallic odor of sickness. The only music in the house was the rhythmic, hollow beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor and the rattle of the wind against the drafty windows. I spent 45 days in that room. I learned the precise curve of her spine and the way her breath hitched when the pain meds started wearing off. I learned to sleep in 10-minute bursts, sitting upright in a kitchen chair, my hand always close to her pulse. And for 45 days, the Gray Army went AWOL. My father, Richard, showed up exactly once. It was a Tuesday. He stood in the doorway for 20 minutes, shifting his weight from one boot to the other, looking everywhere but at the woman dying in the bed. He didn't offer to sit with her. He didn't offer to bring groceries. He just muttered some hollow crap about being too busy at the plant and walked back out to his truck. He didn't come back. My mother, Linda, was worse. She didn't even make it to the porch. She called 3 times a week, but she never asked about Grandma's pain levels. Is she still, coherent? Her voice would crackle through the phone, accompanied by the background noise of a busy shopping mall or a coffee shop. Did she say anything else about the checks, Laura? I've talked to a lawyer. If she's not in her right mind, those cancellations might not hold up. She's dying, Mom, I'd say, my voice like a flat line. We're all struggling, Laura. Grant's shop is falling apart, and I've got bills piling up. You're the one with the steady Army paycheck. You don't understand the pressure we're under. I hung up on her every single time. Grant and Holland were ghosts. As soon as the bank confirmed the money wasn't coming, they vanished. They didn't want to see the reality of death. There was no clout to be found in a room that smelled of antiseptic and sweat. There was no profit in changing a bedpan. They had sniffed around for the payout, and when they found the vault locked, they deserted their post. A soldier doesn't complain about the mission. You just dig in. You hold the line. Late in January, a blizzard buried Hollow Ridge in 2 feet of white silence. The power flickered, leaving us in a dim, orange world of candlelight. The cancer was winning. Grandma Sylvia's eyes were sunken. her skin like yellowed parchment stretched over bone. But her mind was still there. She was still a general, even if her army had been reduced to a single granddaughter. She beckoned me closer. Her hand was cold, the skin so thin I could see the blue map of her veins. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small, heavy object. A brass key. It was old, the metal worn smooth by decades of use. "Laura," she wheezed. Each word cost her a gallon of energy. "When Halverson calls, the lawyer, you give this to him. Only him. Do you understand?" I took the key. It felt like a piece of ice in my palm. I didn't ask what it opened. I didn't ask about the $40 million. I just tucked it into my chest pocket, right over my heart. "Mission accepted, Grandma," I whispered. She gave a tiny, jagged nod. Her eyes closed. February 3rd came with a pale, weak sun. At 5:47 a.m., the heart monitor let out a long, flat tone that seemed to go on forever. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I sat there in the silence, holding her hand as the last bit of warmth drained out of it. I reached over, clicked the monitor off, and pulled the sheet up to her chin. I stood at the foot of the bed and went to attention. I gave her one final, sharp salute. The commander was gone. The watch was over. I pulled out my phone. My fingers were steady, but my chest felt like it was full of broken glass. I called Linda. She picked up on the third ring. I could hear the sound of a hairdryer and the upbeat pop music of a salon in the background. "Mom, she's gone," I said. There was a pause. Not a pause of grief, a pause of calculation. "Oh. Well, I guess that's it then," Linda sighed. "When's the funeral? I hope it's not too soon. I have a hair appointment on the 10th, and you know how hard it is to get in with Marcus. And Laura, don't forget to look for that checkbook before the house gets locked up." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue. I just pressed the red button and cut the connection. I looked at the brass key on the nightstand. The vultures thought they were coming for a funeral. They didn't realize they were walking into a court-martial. I wasn't just the caregiver anymore. I was the keeper of the gate, and I was about to lock them out of everything. The sky over Hollow Ridge didn't cry. It spat a miserable, freezing sleet that turned the cemetery dirt into a gray, sucking sludge. I stood 3 paces back from the open grave, my dress blues crisp despite the dampness, my heels sinking just enough into the mud to anchor me. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the plain pine casket. Richard Gray was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He wore a black wool coat that probably cost more than Grandma's old truck, and he was currently draped over my mother's shoulder, howling like a wounded animal. It was loud, it was theatrical, it was a complete load of crap. My mother. "Oh, my sweet mother," he wailed, his voice cracking just enough to reach the relatives in the back row. Beside him, Holland was busy. She wasn't praying. She was holding her iPhone at chest level, her thumb dancing over the screen as she adjusted the filter on her grieving granddaughter live stream. She made sure to capture a tear trailing down her cheek, perfectly framed against her tight black lace veil. Grant stood off to the side, playing the part of the stoic heir. He shook hands with distant cousins, his face a mask of practiced somberness, but I saw his eyes. They weren't looking at the casket. They were scanning the crowd, calculating who was important and who was just in the way of the payout. The whispers started before the first shovel of dirt hit the wood. "Look at her," a great-aunt muttered, loud enough for me to hear. "Standing there like a statue, not a single tear. Stone cold, that one." "Well, she's military," another replied. "They turn 'em into machines. Probably didn't even care the old woman was dying." I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice, but I didn't turn my head. They didn't know about the 45 nights I'd spent listening to Grandma's lungs rattle. They didn't see me scrubbing the floor at 4 a.m. while they were sleeping off their wine. To them, I was the outsider, the ice queen. I let them talk. In my world, talk is cheap. Silence is where the real work gets done. The dirt hit the casket with a dull, final thud. Richard didn't even wait for the service to end before he pulled his phone out. 24 hours later, the vultures were circling a mahogany table in the offices of Halverson and Associates. The room smelled of expensive leather and stale coffee. Richard sat at the head of the table, his knee bouncing a frantic rhythm against the wood. Holland sat next to him, checking her engagement metrics. Grant was leaning back, arms crossed, looking like he'd already spent the money in his head. They were twitchy, hungry. They had convinced themselves that after the check disaster at Christmas, Grandma Sylvia must have felt guilty. They expected the house, the acreage, and whatever was left of her modest savings. Lawyer Halverson entered the room. He was a bald man with a face like a bulldog and eyes that had seen every low-down trick in the book. He didn't smile. He didn't offer condolences. He just sat down and opened a worn leather briefcase. The dry rattle of legal bond paper was the only sound in the room. "Let's get to it," Richard snapped. "My mother wasn't a woman of many words. Let's see what she left for the family." Halverson adjusted his spectacles. He read through the minor stuff first. $5,000 to the local library, $10,000 to the Hollow Ridge Soup Kitchen. Richard's leg bounced faster. Then Halverson cleared his throat. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "Regarding the residual estate," Halverson began, his voice flat. "This includes the primary residence, all land holdings, and a series of anonymous investment portfolios totaling $40,200,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face froze into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Holland's jaw literally dropped. Grant leaned forward so fast his chair barked against the floorboards. 40 million, Richard managed to choke out. Halverson didn't look up. "The decedent has left the entirety of this estate, in its full sum, to her granddaughter, Laura Gray." The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. I felt the weight of their stares, jagged, hateful, and stunned. $40 million. To the machine. To the one they had called a fool for keeping a scrap of paper. Richard erupted. He stood up so fast his chair flipped over, slamming into the wall. "This is a joke. A sick, demented joke. That woman was senile. Laura manipulated her. She spent 45 days whispering in her ear while she was drugged up on morphine." "Sit down, Mr. Gray," Halverson said, his voice like a gavel. "This is a binding legal document. It was signed, witnessed, and notarized months ago, while your mother was in peak mental health." He adjusted his glasses again and looked at a small handwritten note attached to the back of the will. "There is a final codicil," Halverson added, and I quote, "I leave everything to Laura. She was the only one who came home on Saturdays. She was the only one who cleaned my filth and looked me in the eye when the world went dark. And most importantly, she is the only one who never once asked me what I had." I sat there, my hands flat on my thighs, my spine a straight line of iron. I didn't look away from my father's twisted, ugly face. I saw the realization hit him like a physical blow. He had spent his whole life looking for a payday. And he'd lost it because he couldn't be bothered to drive 200 miles for a cup of coffee. It's a bitter pill to swallow when the person you ignored turns out to be the one holding all the cards. We've all seen it. The family members who only show up when the will is read, crying louder than anyone else just to hide their greed. If you've ever been the one left to do the hard work while the vultures circled, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's stand together against the fakes. If you think Laura earned every cent of that 40 million, type "earned it" in the comments. I'm reading them all. Richard's face went from white to a deep, bruised purple. He looked at me, his teeth bared in a snarl that had nothing to do with grief. "You think you won," he hissed, leaning over the table until I could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You think we're just gonna let a little brat take what belongs to this family? You better get yourself a real army, Laura, because we're coming for that money. And we're gonna burn your life to the ground to get it." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just reached into my pocket and felt the cold weight of the brass key. "The war started a long time ago, Dad," I said, my voice a whisper that filled the room. "You just didn't realize you'd already lost." It took 4 days for the vultures to find a lawyer willing to sell his soul for a percentage of $40 million. I was in the kitchen of Grandma Sylvia's house, scrubbing a stubborn grease stain off the linoleum that Richard had left with his boots weeks ago. The knock was sharp, impatient. It rattled the old window panes in their frames. The man on the porch wore a cheap polyester suit and a bored expression. He didn't ask if I was grieving. He didn't care that the air in the house still felt heavy with the scent of a recent funeral. He just shoved a thick manila envelope into my hand, the paper cold and damp from the sleet. "Laura Gray." "You've been served," he muttered before trudging back to his rusted Toyota Corolla. I sat at the scarred oak table, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. The paper felt heavy, coated in the kind of legal jargon designed to suffocate the truth. Undue influence. Coercion. Psychological manipulation of a vulnerable adult. I scanned the bottom of the complaint. There they were. The signatures of Richard Gray and Grant Gray. My father and my brother. They weren't just asking for the money anymore. They were calling me a predator. They were claiming I'd abused the woman I'd spent 10 long years protecting. They were trying to turn my loyalty into a crime. I leaned back in the chair. My spine didn't bend. I felt a dry, hollow laugh rattle in my chest. It was the sound of a bullet sliding into a chamber. They thought they were dragging me into a courtroom to humiliate me. They didn't realize they were walking straight into a kill zone that Grandma Sylvia had spent months surveying with the precision of a master strategist. I grabbed my keys and the small brass key from my pocket. I didn't call Richard. I didn't send a warning shot. I drove straight to the center of town. The F-150 groaned in the cold, the heater failing to keep the frost off the cracked dashboard. Halverson's office felt colder than the morgue. He was waiting by the door, his leather briefcase already snapped shut. He looked at the summons in my hand and gave a grim, tired nod. "They're going for blood, Laura," he said. His voice was a low growl. "They want to freeze the assets. They're telling the judge you drugged her with morphine to get that signature. They're painting you as the villain of the century." "Let them talk," I said. My voice was a flat line. "I have the key." We walked across the street to First National Bank. The brick building looked like a fortress in the gray winter light. Benedict Strom met us in the lobby. He didn't speak. He just led us past the tellers, past the glass offices, and down into the bowels of the bank. The air in the vault was dead. It was cold, recycled, and tasted like old metal and graphite. Benedict stood before the wall of safety deposit boxes. Box 402. I pulled the small brass key from my pocket. It looked like a toy compared to the massive steel door of the vault, but it was the only thing that mattered. I slid it into the lock. Click. The sound echoed in the small, silent room. The steel drawer slid out with a heavy, grinding groan that vibrated in my teeth. There were no gold bars, no bundles of $100 bills, just a stack of documents tied with a simple piece of twine. "Scout reports," I whispered. I pulled the first folder out. It was a thick stack of medical reports. "Sylvia knew they would do this," Halverson said, his voice echoing against the cold steel walls. "She spent the last 6 months of her life preparing for the lie." I flipped the pages. 3 different doctors, 3 independent psychiatric evaluations. Dr. Aris from Portland, Dr. Miller from Boston, a state-certified specialist. Each one had the same conclusion, stamped in bright red ink. Sylvia Gray is of sound mind. Patient possesses full cognitive capacity and remains free of external coercion. The dates were the knife in the heart of Richard's case. She had been evaluated 3 weeks before she signed the final will. And again, 10 days after. She had been checked for lucidity while Richard was at the local bar, and Grant was losing money at the casino. Beneath the evaluations were the receipts. Every vial of pain medication, every box of sterile gauze. Every hour of private nursing I'd paid for when the cancer got too heavy for one person to lift. I had the bank statements showing the withdrawals from my own military savings account. I had paid for her dignity while my family had been looking for her hidden checkbook. And then I saw the other folder. Halverson had been busy. He had subpoenaed the family credit card statements. While I was paying for Grandma's hospice care in cash, Richard had spent $3,000 on a new set of golf clubs. Grant had spent $2,000 on a brand building trip to Vegas. Linda had a recurring bill at a high-end spa in Portland. At the bottom of the box lay the real weapon. It was a blue leather journal, the edges frayed and the cover stained with old coffee and years of handling. I recognized Grandma's handwriting immediately. It was sharp, slanted, and unapologetic. I opened it to the middle. February 5th, 2015. Laura came home today. She fixed the leak in the kitchen sink. She didn't ask for a dime. Richard called twice, wanted to borrow the truck, didn't ask about my hip. I flipped through the pages. It was a logbook of a decade of neglect and loyalty. 487 entries. 487 Saturdays. August 12th, 2018. Laura brought over some supplies from the base. We talked about the desert. She looks tired, but her eyes are still clear. She's the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm a bank account. Each entry was a strike. Each page was a casualty report. She had recorded every time Richard forgot her birthday and every time Grant stole from her purse. This wasn't just a diary. It was a pre-recorded testimony from beyond the grave. I closed the book. The weight of it was more than $40 million. It was the weight of a life lived right. This isn't a lawsuit, I said, my voice cold and lethal. This is a court-martial. I tucked the blue journal under my arm. I walked toward the elevator, the brass key still gripped in my hand. Tomorrow was the preliminary hearing. I was going to show the world exactly what my father's signature was worth. March arrived in Hollow Ridge with a damp, bone-deep chill. The county courthouse smelled of industrial floor wax, old radiator steam, and the sour breath of people waiting for a payday. I sat on the hard wooden bench of the witness stand, my back a steel rod, my dress blues unwrinkled. Across the aisle, Richard sat with his chin high, his eyes narrowed as if he'd already won. Beside him, Grant was chewing on his lip, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. They looked like a family. I looked like a soldier. Their lawyer, a man named Sterling with a suit so shiny it looked like oil, paced the floor between the bench and my seat. He tapped a gold pen against his palm, a rhythmic, annoying sound that filled the silent room. Captain Gray, Sterling began, his voice a smooth, practiced drawl. You were stationed thousands of miles away for the better part of a decade. Afghanistan, Iraq, bases in the South. You were a stranger to this house, yet you want this court to believe that a dying, vulnerable woman suddenly decided to hand you $40 million. Why you, Captain? Why not the son who lived 5 miles away? Why not the daughter who called her every week? Richard sneered from the gallery seats. He was leaning forward, waiting for me to crack. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to scream about the unfairness of it all. I didn't give him a second of satisfaction. I looked directly at Sterling, my eyes locking onto his until he stopped tapping that pen. I showed up because today was Saturday, I said. My voice didn't echo. It just landed, heavy and flat like a lead weight. That is the only reason. Sterling scoffed, a jagged, ugly sound. A Saturday? You're telling this court $40 million is the price of a few Saturday visits? Halverson stood up. He didn't say a word. He walked to the judge's bench and laid down the stack of psychiatric evaluations, the ones with the red stamps from Portland and Boston. Then, he placed the blue leather journal on top of them. Your Honor, Halverson said, his voice a low growl. Captain Gray didn't just show up for a few visits. She showed up for 487 Saturdays over the last 10 years. While the plaintiffs were at golf courses, spas, and casinos, my client was scrubbing floors, fixing leaks, and paying for medical supplies out of her own pocket. The judge, a silver-haired woman with eyes like flint, pulled the journal toward her. She flipped through the pages. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the dry rustle of paper, the sound of my grandmother's ghost testifying. The judge stopped at a page near the end, her eyes scanning Sylvia's sharp, slanted handwriting. She looked up, her gaze shifting from the book to Richard. It wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Case dismissed, the judge said. The gavel hit the wooden block with a crack that sounded like a bone snapping. With prejudice, the plaintiffs will be responsible for all legal fees, Effective immediately. Get out of my courtroom. The air in the room didn't return. It exploded. Richard didn't move. He sat there, his face turning a sickly, mottled purple. Grant slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. They hadn't just lost $40 million. They had just been handed a bill for a legal battle they couldn't afford. I stood up and walked toward the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. In the hallway, the pack caught up. The heavy oak doors swung open and Richard charged toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure hate. He looked like a man who had been gut-shot. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed, his spit hitting the lapel of my uniform. "You manipulated her. You stole what belonged to me. You're the most cold-blooded bitch I've ever known." Grant stepped in front of me, blocking the path to the stairs. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot. "How do you sleep, Laura? Knowing you've got all that money while your own brother is going under. Don't you feel a shred of guilt? Don't you feel anything?" I stopped. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I looked Grant in the eye, my face a mask of iron discipline. "No, Grant," I said, my voice a whisper that cut through his panic. "Not a shred." A flash went off to my left. A local reporter from the Hollow Ridge Gazette was standing by the water fountain, his camera still aimed at us. He'd caught it all, the rage, the desperation, and my total, lethal indifference. The dominoes didn't just fall, they crumbled. By the next morning, the headline ran across the front page. "The Saturday Daughter. Legacy of Loyalty versus Family Greed." The town of Hollow Ridge is a small pond, and the ripple effect was a tidal wave. Richard's boss at the manufacturing plant saw the paper. He didn't want a man who sued his own dying mother for undue influence representing the company's management. Richard was handed a pink slip before lunch. A 58-year-old man with a black mark on his soul and no prospects. Holland's world ended in a lawyer's office 2 days later. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, the bank had flagged her hidden credit card debts, $80,000 of lifestyle spending she'd kept secret from her husband. He filed for divorce before the ink on the newspaper was dry. Grant's construction business was the last to go. With the court ordering him to pay Halverson's astronomical legal fees, his lines of credit were yanked. The bank put a padlock on his shop door and a foreclosure sign in his front yard. They had tried to use the law as a weapon to strip me of my grandmother's gift. Instead, they had built their own gallows. I hadn't fired a single shot, but the battlefield was covered in their casualties. I drove back to the hill that afternoon. The snow was finally melting, revealing the dead brown grass beneath. I stood in the empty kitchen of the house, the silence no longer heavy but clean. I reached into the cupboard and found a small, rusted tin box tucked behind the flour. Inside was a single photograph I'd never seen before, and a map of a town in Maine I couldn't pronounce. The war was over, but the secret was just beginning to breathe. May in Hollow Ridge didn't feel like spring. It felt like a fever. The air in the back tool shed was thick, smelling of rusted iron, dry rot, and 40 years of forgotten chores. I stood in the center of the cramped space, my boots kicking up layers of gray dust that danced in the sharp shafts of sunlight cutting through the roof. I was there to clear the wreckage, but instead I found the heart of the fortress. Tucked under a pile of moth-eaten wool blankets was a heavy iron chest. It didn't have a flashy lock. It didn't need one. It was buried under the weight of a life lived without pretense. I pried the lid open, the hinges screaming in protest, and found a small black ledger. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't a record of Saturdays or visits. It was a casualty report for the town's poverty. I sat on a stack of old tires and flipped through the pages. For 40 years, Grandma Sylvia had been running a covert operation. There were no names of stockbrokers or luxury brands. Instead, there were entries for Hollow Ridge Elementary, overdue lunch accounts, high school textbook fees, winter coat drive, anonymous. I ran my thumb over the final total, $284,600. While Richard was busy calling her a senile fraud, and Grant was looking for a way to pawn her silver, this woman had been quietly keeping the children of this town from going hungry. She didn't want a plaque on a wall. She didn't want a thank you note. She just wanted the bills paid. In the silence of that shed, the magnitude of her grit hit me harder than any bullet ever could. My bloodline had spent decades trying to drain her dry, never realizing she was pouring herself out for people who actually deserved it. The peace of the shed didn't last. By mid-June, the buzz of the lawsuit had settled into a stagnant, poisonous gossip that choked the town. I was standing on the porch, watching the heat shimmer rise off the gravel driveway, when a white sedan pulled in. It wasn't the luxury SUV Linda used to drive. It was a beat-up rental, the bumper hanging by a prayer. Linda climbed out of the car. She looked like a ghost that had stayed too long at a bad party. Her face was haggard, the skin sallow and hanging loose where expensive fillers used to sit. Her makeup was a smeared mess of charcoal and desperation. As she walked toward the steps, the smell of her knockoff Chanel perfume hit me. Sharp, floral, and utterly fake. "Laura," she whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't wait for an invite. She lunged forward, wrapping her thin arms around my waist, her head buried in my chest. She smelled of gin and cigarettes. She started to sob. Great, racking heaves that sounded like a dry engine trying to turn over. "I am so sorry, honey." I was confused. We were all so stressed. Richard, he pushed us. He made us think you were the enemy. "Can you ever forgive your mother?" I didn't move. I kept my hands at my sides, my spine a straight line of cold iron. I watched a hawk circle the hills in the distance, waiting for a kill. I knew the timing. I'd seen this play in the sand 100 times. The surrender was always a setup for an ambush. It took exactly 2 minutes and 48 seconds for the tears to dry. Linda pulled back, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. She looked at the house, her eyes scanning the windows as if she were already measuring for new curtains. "The spa's in trouble, Laura. Those people in town, they're so cruel. They've started a boycott. The bank is calling the loans. I'm going to lose everything. I just need 100,000. Just a small bridge loan to get me through the summer. It's a drop in the bucket for you now. You have tens of millions, honey. You can't let your own mother end up on the street." I looked at her. I didn't see a mother. I saw a scavenger. She didn't care about the woman who had just been buried. She didn't care about the 487 Saturdays I'd spent in the trenches. She just wanted to keep her nails polished while the world burned. "No," I said. The word was small, flat, absolute. Linda froze. The fake grief evaporated, replaced by a mask of jagged, ugly fury. Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. "Excuse me?" "You heard me, Linda. I will not give you a single cent, not for the spa, not for the bills, not for a cup of coffee." "You selfish little brat," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the valley walls. "I gave birth to you. I raised you. You're sitting on a fortune that belongs to this family, and you're going to let me starve?" I stepped back, my hand resting on the heavy oak door. "That money doesn't belong to this family. It belongs to the people Grandma Sylvia actually loved." I pulled a legal document from the hallway table and held it out. "Lawyer Halverson is filing the paperwork on Monday. I'm establishing the Sylvia Gray Scholarship Fund. $20 million is being moved into a trust. It's going to pay for every school lunch, every textbook, and every college application in this county for the next 50 years. Linda's face went white. She looked like she'd been struck in the chest. 20 million? You're giving it away? To strangers? To people who know the value of a Saturday," I said. I didn't wait for the scream. I didn't wait for the curses I knew were coming. I stepped back into the house and felt the cool, quiet air of the hallway wrap around me. I reached out and pulled the door shut. The sound of the latch was the final report of the war. I stood in the dim light of the entryway, listening to my mother's muffled rage on the other side of the wood. She pounded on the door, her voice a shrill, pathetic sound that finally faded into the wind. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel regret. I just felt clean. The battlefield had been swept. The vultures had been starved out. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my rucksack. It was time to leave Hollow Ridge behind. I had one more mission to complete, and it started with a drive toward the Maine coast. The ink on my honorable discharge papers was dry. August in Georgia is a kiln, a thick, suffocating heat that makes your uniform feel like lead. but Hollow Ridge was a tomb I was finally ready to seal. I stood in the driveway of the old house one last time. The air didn't smell like pine anymore. It smelled like stagnant water and the bitter aftertaste of a war that had left no survivors on the other side. My rucksack was light. I had stripped my life down to the essentials. A few changes of clothes, my service records, and a corn-yellow wool sweater that was starting to fray at the cuffs. Meg was waiting by the porch. She was the only person in this town who had looked at Grandma Sylvia with something other than a calculation in her eyes. She was old, her skin like crumpled parchment, but her grip was like a vice. I handed her the heavy iron keys to the house. "It's yours, Meg," I said. My voice was a flat, low rasp. "Turn it into a bookstore. Turn it into a shelter. I don't care. Just don't let a gray ever set foot on this porch again." Meg didn't offer a hug. She just nodded, her eyes scanning the empty windows. "What about you, Laura? Where does a soldier go when the fighting stops?" "Somewhere the wind is cold enough to keep the vultures away," I replied. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror as I drove toward the coast. I didn't need to see the for sale signs on Grant's property or the empty storefront where Linda's spa used to be. I had cleared the battlefield. The wreckage was their problem now. I drove north for 12 hours, the hum of the F-150's tires against the asphalt, the only music I needed. I crossed the Maine border as a gray, salt-heavy fog rolled in off the Atlantic. I found a small wood cabin in a town where people didn't care about your last name or your bank balance. It was a rugged place built from cedar and grit, perched on a cliff that took the full force of the ocean's temper. I registered as a PE teacher at the local elementary school. The salary was $51,200 a year. It was enough to pay for coffee, firewood, and tuna for the stray cat that had decided my porch was his new base of operations. He was a ragged, one-eared tabby with a suspicious glare. I named him Cather. One afternoon, I left the maize yellow sweater on the porch chair while I chopped wood. When I came back, Cather was curled in the center of the wool, his purr a low, vibrating engine that seemed to settle into the very grain of the wood. I sat on the steps, my hands calloused and stained with sap, and watched him. The biggest asset I owned wasn't the black card in my wallet or the $40 million sitting in a trust for kids I'd never meet. It was the silence. My phone didn't ring. There were no frantic texts about credit card debt, no howling voicemails about family loyalty. I had built a fortress of no contact, and for the first time in 30 years, the perimeter was secure. I sat on the porch every morning with a mug of black coffee, watching the Atlantic churn. The waves didn't care about wills or lawsuits. They just kept hitting the rocks, relentless and disciplined. I realized then that I hadn't won because of the money. Money is just paper. I'd seen my father prove that in a fireplace on Christmas Eve. I won because I was a soldier who knew how to stay on post. I won because when the world went dark and the vultures started circling, I didn't flinch. I kept the watch. I drove those hundreds of miles every Saturday not because I wanted a payout, but because a mission is a mission. You don't leave a man behind on the battlefield, and you don't leave a grandmother behind in a house with a leaking roof. That discipline, that cold, hard loyalty, was the only inheritance that mattered. It was the only thing Richard and Grant couldn't sue me for. They didn't have the stomach for it. They wanted the prize without the patrol. They wanted the crown without the thorns. I stood up and stretched, my spine popping in the cold morning air. I looked down at Cather, who was still kneading the yellow wool of the sweater. The sun was a pale, weak sliver on the horizon, cutting through the Maine fog like a bayonet. I had a class to teach at 8. I had a life to build from scratch. I reached into my pocket and felt the small brass key. I walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down at the churning gray water below. The salt spray hit my face, sharp and clean. I didn't hesitate. I didn't pray. I just opened my hand and let the metal slip through my fingers. The key disappeared into the white foam without a sound. I turned back toward the cabin, the smell of wood smoke and salt clinging to my skin. The mission was officially over. I stepped inside, closed the door, and for the first time in my life, I didn't bother to check the lock.